So the Buddha did not teach the Four Noble Truths in the order in which they arise, right? That's been pointed out by many lamas and scholars and things like that. I'm not making that up. It's the point that's been noted by many people. So he taught them actually not in the order in which they arise, but he taught them in the order in which you realize them, right, for practice. And so that's the order we're going to study them in, because that's what we're trying to do, right? In other words, if you think about how does, of course, you have the origin of suffering, which leads to suffering, and so on. But here, it's when you're actually trying to practice the path. What order do you practice? What order do you realize them in? What order do you come to understand them in? And they often, when scholars say that, they often make a certain point, which is they often point out that they say it's similar to a illness, right? Like, in other words, if you're sick, right? First, you know that actually, so like, do you ever have that experience, like, where you're, oh, am I getting sick, or am I just tired, or it's just like you're trying to figure out if you're sick, right? And then if you realize, oh, I'm sick, there's something wrong, then you want to find out what is it. Like, actually, over the holidays, I got COVID, right? So it was like, I remember at the beginning, I was going, well, I don't know, am I just tired? I'd just flown home from Rhode Island, so I was like, oh, am I tired from the flight and travel, or am I sick? I can't quite tell. The came point was like, oh no, something's wrong, right? So I went to the doctor. I took the COVID test. I took a COVID test and then called my doctor. And he said, oh, it's COVID. We figured out it's COVID, right? So then it's like, oh, that's the cause, right? Then what's the treatment? Is there a treatment? But so then and then so on. So, right. So first you have to be aware that there's suffering. Then you look for the cause, and then you try to treat the cause. Then is this something treatable, right? If it's treatable, then you take the treatment. So it's a practical order. But anyway, we'll go further into it now. So the first noble truth, right, is true sufferings, right? Or the truth of dukkha, right? Suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Sometimes it's translated as, there are different translations, but and one point I want to make as we start to explore these is Dharmakirti. Dharmakirti is one of the great logicians, right? And he was a teacher of Pramana. He wrote the Pramana Vartika. And so Pramana is not just they translate Pramana as like valid cognition, right? So it's like also it includes logic, but it also includes like epistemology. How do we know what we know, right? How do we come to know things? That kind of exploration. And so he pointed out in the Pramana Vartika that these 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths specifically overcome 16, the translator who I was using said, wrong aspects, or like points of confusion, wrong understandings that we have. And those wrong understandings lead to craving and to continuing in samsara. So as you meditate on these 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, they're intended to overcome in yourself some wrong understandings, if that makes sense, in order to then be able to practice the Buddhist path. And so these four aspects, so there are four aspects of the truth of suffering, right? And I'll say it now, the four wrong understandings that those help overcome are commonly taught. The other ones you may not have heard of, these you might have heard of. So they're the views of the wrong views of permanence, of purity, of pleasure, that samsara is pleasurable, and of self. Actually, if you were part of the series of classes we did on the Uttara Tantra recently, we talked about those, right? And that those are four wrong views. And then in the Uttara Tantra, it says that, Buddha nature, right, is actually that in samsara, there's nothing permanent, but Buddha nature is permanent, right? Through Buddha nature, you achieve the permanent. It's but in samsara, there's nothing pure, but through Buddha nature, you achieve pure, and so on. Actually, I think it's the Dharmakaya that is permanent. The Dharmakaya is permanent, pure, pleasurable, and the self that's no self. That's the way they put it. But here we're talking about samsara, so there is no, so anyway, so the four wrong views are holding what is unpleasurable to be pleasurable, holding what's impermanent to be permanent, holding what's impure to be pure, and holding what it lacks a self to have a self. So through these four contemplations, you overcome those, and you develop, actually, and through these four contemplations, you can begin to develop genuine renunciation, or you can develop genuine renunciation. So when we say the truth of suffering, right? First of all, there's in the teachings, it said on teachings on this topic, it says, what's the basis that you're looking at, right? When we say suffering. And they say the answer is, in this case, the basis is your own 5 appropriated aggregates. Right? So that your 5 aggregates. So, often we say that, right? When we say, what is samsaric suffering, right? And then it's not it's actually this, right? It's this, the kind of aggregates I have. The body and mind I have. That's samsaric suffering. And then another point in the Lamrim, when you study, there are different lists of sufferings, right? There are the 3 sufferings and the 6 sufferings. There are some Lamrims, I think, list 8 and some list 10. But here I'm going to mention the 3 sufferings, right? So in the 3 types of suffering, there's the suffering of suffering, which actually everybody, even animals, recognize, right? That's like illness and pain. And then there's the suffering of change, right? Which is like, for example, like if you're feeling cold, and so you go someplace warm, right? And you have to experience some pleasure, right? But then that pleasure, if you stay in the warm place long enough, right, then eventually you get uncomfortable. If you're, the point is that in samsara, what's actually one way of saying it, one Lama said it this way: when you experience the suffering of suffering, it doesn't become pleasure, right? But when you experience samsaric pleasures, they eventually become suffering. That's one way of putting it, right? So through the process of change. And then there's the 3rd type of suffering, which they sometimes call the pervasive compounded suffering. And my point is, that's the main one being referred to here. And the pervasive compounded suffering, I sometimes call it existential suffering, but it's the suffering of having aggregates that are not under the control, they're not under your control, actually. They're under the control of karma and mental afflictions. Right? So that's the pervasive compounded suffering. It's that you're not in control of your own being, actually. Your being is controlled by something else. And what it's controlled by is not pure, right? What's controlled by is your past karma and mental afflictions. And so that's the main kind of suffering. Now I want to ask you, before I go on, when you meditated on compassion, right, earlier, which type of suffering were you focused on? Right? Was it the suffering of suffering? Like when you thought of, oh, okay, when I say, okay, meditate on compassion now, or like it's a common practice in Buddhism, right? Which kind of suffering do you tend to focus on? And one point I make is like focusing on any kind of suffering is good. It's compassion, right? And so if you focus on the hunger of an animal, you focus on somebody who, I don't know, bumped their toe, something like that's compassion. It's a suffering that you're wishing to free somebody from, and that's good. But for your spiritual practice, right, eventually you have to come to the main point. You can meditate on compassion for all kinds of suffering, and that's good. But when it comes to bodhicitta, right, cultivating bodhicitta, the main focus becomes this pervasive compounded suffering. And by the way, actually, that's how, otherwise also it's quite difficult, isn't it? Like to meditate on, to have equanimity, right? Because, if you meditate, like, so, if you meditate on, say, the suffering of one group of people, right? Then it becomes sometimes easy to then think, oh, but this other group of people doesn't have that kind of suffering, right? If you think of the suffering of poverty, then you might actually get annoyed with people who are multi-billionaires or something like that, right? And so on. But when you think about the pervasive compounded suffering, all beings of samsara share that, right? All beings of samsara are equally subject to that. So anyway, that's in when cultivating bodhicitta or renunciation, actually, you focus on all the kinds of suffering, but at a certain point you have to focus mainly on this pervasive compounded suffering, because actually, if you don't address that one, the other two will continue. The other two are more superficial, and if you don't address this deepest form of suffering, the other two will come back over and over and over endlessly. So the real solution is to focus also on this pervasive compounded suffering. Okay, so then the four aspects of the truth of suffering. So the first is impermanent. That's what it says in the text. And it says impermanent here refers to, in Buddhism in general, refers to moment. I think a good translation is momentariness, right? So there's gross impermanence, which means you get old. We all get old. We all get sick. We all die. But then that's dependent upon momentariness, momentary impermanence, which means we change instant by instant. And actually, gross impermanence wouldn't happen if there weren't momentary impermanence. So you get, like, we don't notice our process of aging from one moment to the next, right? But that's actually how it's happening, isn't it? Then eventually you go, oh, I have more gray hair. Oh, I have more wrinkles. Or, oh, I'm not able to do something I used to be able to do. So that's gross impermanence, but it's dependent upon this momentary impermanence. And another way they sometimes talk about momentary impermanence is disintegration, right? Things disintegrate moment by moment. So one point is, understanding impermanence overcomes the wrong view of permanence, those wrong views I mentioned earlier. And so how is impermanence, though, related to suffering, right? And why do we contemplate it? And so there are many points that are made, but one point is, like, if you start with the grosser kinds of impermanence and the grosser kinds of suffering, right? In the lists in the Lamrim, when you study the truth of suffering, some of the kinds of suffering are things like illness, aging, and death, or being separated from what like, so you finally meet a person you really want to spend time with, but then eventually you'll be parted, right? All meetings end in parting. Actually, I thought that I was noticing that actually, I remember when my mom's partner died. I thought, oh, they had a very successful relationship because they stayed together till he died, but then he died. That's the way it works, right? Like, so a successful relationship, each part that way. Otherwise you part before then. But all meetings end in parting. Right. So on a gross level, you can see suffering is related to that, right? Or not getting what you want, right? Like, so you keep trying to get something and you can't get it. And, anyway, that's all connected to that things are impermanent and uncertain. And, you can see that, right? In samsara, there's no certainty because everything changes. Then also, though, the right page. Another point worth noting here, though, is that so then if you go deeper, right, these compounded aggregates, right, these so your mind and body change instant by instant, right? So now we're getting to a deeper contemplation, right? If you start meditating on this, right, then first you would meditate on gross impermanence, and you would recognize that decreases your attachment, and you see the connection between gross impermanence and suffering. Then you meditate on how these compounded aggregates, this body and this mind, change instant by instant. Um, and that's the nature of these aggregates. And actually, one way of saying it is like they sometimes point this out, right? When a body arises, when a body and mind, a birth arises through the power of karma and mental afflictions, that in and of itself is the cause of that impermanence, right? So its very nature is to be impermanent. Its very nature is to change and to age, and it's changing instant by instant. And within that momentary, and then you start to reflect on how actually it's quite disturbing, actually, if you think about it, right? In terms of this momentariness of having aggregates that are controlled by karma and mental afflictions, which is different than a Buddha's aggregates, right? Buddha's are, bodies. Like that, because I was saying earlier that it contradicts the view of permanence, right? So we hold, actually, it's true, isn't it? Like, even if we meditate on impermanence sometimes, if we don't realize it, like, we're surprised when things happen, right? Which means we haven't understood impermanence, right? So when it says you grasp at the view of permanence, one point is like you might think, well, no, I understand impermanence, right? I know that. But then, like, when someone you care about suddenly dies, you're surprised, right? Or if you suddenly get some diagnosis, some terrible diagnosis, right? Then we're surprised. Or if an airplane, which is on news, an airplane crashes, we're surprised. Um, and actually, Arya Deva says, he says, he makes a point like that in the 400 verses where he says, people go like to somebody they know dies, right? They go to the memorial or funeral or something. So then, like, he says, everybody there, including you, is going to die, right? And it may be today. You don't know when, right? And these aggregates that we have, this is the part that's quite disturbing, actually, is that, because we're under the power of our karma and mental afflictions, that we don't know. We don't know what the karma is. We don't understand that. We don't know our own karma, right? We don't have that kind of ability. So there's like what's the word? Put it in words, like if you meditate like this, it's like you're like they sometimes say it's like a water bubble, right? Your life is like a water bubble. And at any moment, something good or something terrible may happen. And you're not in control of any of it, actually. You're in control of a tiny bit, right? But actually, even what you think you're in control of, you may not be in control of a second from now. Right? And that's the nature of these kind of aggregates, right? Like we all know stories like that, right? Somebody says, "Oh, I'm in control," "Oh, I'm in control of this," and then they're doing it, and then they have an aneurysm and fall over dead, right? And you have no control over that, right? So there's kind of, what's the word? On the one hand, yeah, there's that's a deeper kind of suffering, let's put it that way, right? And it's the nature of these aggregates, and as long as you have these aggregates, there's no escaping that, actually, until you're enlightened, until you have different kind of aggregates, right? Until you have different kind of body and mind. The Buddha's Buddha's body and mind, or Arya's body and mind. Then you're that's the nature of, and it's funny, right? Like we say, I want to escape that, but it's the very nature of your own body and mind. Okay, you get the point there. So that's part of impermanence. Then the second of the four aspects of the truth of suffering is suffering. And so one point they make is because your well, I'll read what they say here. Suffering includes the three types of suffering. Right, so there's suffering of suffering, like you have, we already went through, right? You might have pain in your back or pain in your knee or something like that, right? There's the suffering of change, which is like, so for example, if you're hungry and you start eating, right? then you feel relief. But if you keep eating, then eventually your stomach starts to hurt. And then you start to worry about your cholesterol or your weight or something or other if you eat too much. And then the point here, though, is the pervasive compounded suffering. And that is one's contaminated aggregates are produced by karma and mental afflictions, right? And so we're under the control of those. So we're not in control of ourselves. And the point here is, going back to the 4 wrong views that could overcome, is pleasure, right? In other words, that we oftentimes think samsara, if we don't think about it, right? We can think, well, like, I'm not really suffering, like, and when you think about suffering, you might think, oh, some other, like, oh, somebody who's going through some kind of terrible event is suffering, but I'm not, right? And if you think that way, right, or if you think, well, I'm okay, like they say, viewing samsara as a pleasure garden or something like that, right? Some kind of wrong understanding like that. So part of the contemplation here is, sometimes I'm having the suffering of suffering, but I'm always having the pervasive compounded suffering. It's in the nature of my being. And we don't understand that. Like, that's not how we relate to our lives day to day. So we have to contemplate and say, is this true? And part of this that Khench Rinpoche was getting at is, so you check. In other words, is it true that my body is impermanent moment to moment? Is it true that I don't have control, that that my body, that because my aggregates are in this nature, right? Like, so you check, for example, are they under the control of mental afflictions? Actually, can you stop mental afflictions? If you say, okay, today I'm not going to have any jealousy or anger or pride or craving, do you have that ability? Right? Or not? If you don't, then you're under the control of the mental afflictions, right? And then do I have control over my experiences? Like, if I say, well, today only pleasant things are going to happen to me, do I have the power to make that happen? No, actually, right? And without my control, right, like, small bad things may happen or huge bad things may happen, right? Like, when somebody was sitting in Ukraine, they weren't thinking, oh, I'd like to live in a war. So I'm talking about normal, not politician, but just normal person, right? They weren't thinking, oh, how wonderful it would be to be attacked by Russian army, right? But it happens, Or recently I went to a memorial for a friend he was my age and he suddenly got diagnosed with cancer and died, right? Like, that was without choice, right? He didn't want to get cancer, but it happens. So when you contemplate and you say, you check for your own logic and your own experience, right? So one is, are my aggregates impermanent by moment, each moment? You have to check for yourself, right? And you might say, well, obviously they are, but then you don't think about it, right? But so the part of this is why Khench Rinpoche said you contemplate it over and over. You go, wow, that really is the nature of my aggregates. And do I relate to my life as if that were true? Like, when I see somebody, do I interact with them as if they and I may die in a moment, and as if we're all under the control of this kind of other factors, right, that may change everything in an instant. And again, like, do I relate to my life as if, first of all, is it true that my aggregates, my body and mind, are in the nature of suffering, a pervasive uncertainty, a pervasive unsatisfactoriness? And if so, am I relating to them that way? Right? And if I'm not relating to that way, then I don't know that I don't actually haven't realized that point. Right? And what this is suggesting is, if you realize that, you'll seek liberation. Right? So, am I seeking liberation day after day? Is that my main focus, or is my main focus something else? And if I haven't realized this, then that won't be my main focus. That's what the teachings are saying. Right? Then the next of the 4 aspects of the truth of suffering is empty. And this one, I imagine, I'll share my own initial reaction was, wait a second, empty? Like, this is the truth of suffering. Isn't that a more advanced point? How does that relate? Right? Why is it empty? And so empty in this context means empty of that first of all, it's connected to the gross level, according to this tenet system, the gross level of selflessness, which is empty of a permanent unitary independent self. And remember, like I said this before, a permanent unitary independent self is a self that's independent of the aggregates. So it's like a soul, right? In other words, that there's not a soul that's controlling um, these contaminated aggregates. Yeah, there's not a self that's a different, and one way to say it is a different entity than the aggregates, right? Some kind of, so it's like an eternal soul or an Atman. Um, and according to this tenet system we're studying now, that's the gross level of selflessness. So you could ask, I want to pause and reflect. So wait a second, you might say, I said this initially, well, wait a second, we're talking about the truth of suffering. Why are we saying now there's no, yes, there's no independent unitary uh, um, unitary permanent self, but how does that relate? And here what is being gotten at is this, is that you don't have, first of all, there is no self like that, right? There's no permanent unitary, there's no independent self that's independent of the aggregates. And so sorry, say it right. Like you, on the one hand, the self is connected to these suffering aggregates, right? Um, and sorry, let me say it right. If I want to be free from them, see, because this is getting at, can you achieve freedom from the sorry, right, from suffering? Because in order to develop renunciation, you have to understand that it's possible that that you're not that suffering, those suffering aggregates. And so one point is, what is the nature of the self that suffers? That's what's being gotten at here. And is there, so first I'll explore it just a bit, right? So is there a self, right, that is, I don't want to actually find the quote from Kensher here. So one point Ken Rimshay made here was this, was actually it's a profound point, is that when you understand there's not a permanent, I'll just say it this way, that there's not a self that's separate from the aggregates. One point is you start to feel like a prisoner, right? Who's trapped in aggregates conditioned by karma and mental afflictions. And actually, that's part of this contemplating the truth of suffering. You recognize you are like a prisoner. Um, and that this idea of an Atman or eternal soul, right? That could, sometimes, and actually it's a comforting story, right? Like you say, oh, well, when you die, like, even if you just live a mediocre life and then you have some kind of faith, you'll go to heaven and you'll be fine, right? And what Buddhism is saying is, no, you won't. As long as you're under the control, actually, it's logical analysis, right? It's saying, as long as you're under the control of karma and mental afflictions, you're going to continue to have these kinds of problems, right? Especially the pervasive compounded problem of samsara. And so you start to feel this sense of there's no other choice but to address that suffering, right? There's not some kind of, what's the word? There's not some kind of soul that can go somewhere else apart from the aggregates, right? You're not going to escape that way. You're trapped until you overcome, until you have an antidote. Does that make sense? Until you find an antidote to the cause of suffering, you're not going to be free from it. You're trapped in it. And then the next one is selfless. That's the fourth of the four. And selfless here means here in this case it means according to this tenet system, it's the subtle level of selflessness, right? So which means lacking a self-sufficient, substantially existed self. And that's a self, not a self separate from the aggregates. That's the view that there's a self, that's the self-grasping, the object of negation. There is this grasping at a self in the aggregates. We feel like there's a controller of the aggregates, or we're in the aggregates, we control the aggregates, or they're my aggregates, an owner, something like that, right? Which is actually our innate, what we innately grasp at, that there's a self here, right, in our mind, or in our, sometimes we identify it with the body, sometimes we identify it with the mind, right? That's where, and we comes out in our language, right? My body, or my mind is, like that. And one point is this is so and why do you have to realize that? Again, you might ask, why do you have to realize that? What is the relation of that to the truth of suffering? Because at this point, we're not talking, I mean, where we're contemplating at this level, we're not talking about that you've realized selflessness directly, right? What's being gotten at is this: is you've been contemplating those first up to now, right? Up to this point, in contemplating that 16 aspects of Four Noble Truths, you've been contemplating how the aggregates, right? These contaminated aggregates are um, like a prison, and that they're in the nature of suffering, that they're under the control of karma and delusions, and therefore mental afflictions, and therefore uh, are that they're pervaded by suffering, that it's their nature to suffer. And so you might feel some sense of almost horror at that, or sorrow at that. And then the point here is this: is if you don't realize this last point, selflessness, the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, then how can you wish to become free from suffering, right? In other words, so what's being gotten at here is that yourself, that the nature of the aggregates is suffering, right? But you're not a self within those aggregates. It's connected in a way. I mean, they don't say this in the teachings, but if you studied Buddha nature, um, it's not unlike that teaching, right? So, in other words, what you're getting at here is, wow, these aggregates, this kind of life, having this kind of body and mind, yeah, is in the nature of suffering, is unsatisfactory, is deeply uncertain, changes instant by instant. I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes there's extremely gross suffering, but always there's this uncertainty. Always I'm not in control of my own destiny. Um, and there is no self in those aggregates, which then opens up the possibility of renunciation. And what Ken Rinpoche pointed out was, he said, actually, if you think that somehow yourself is in the aggregates in some kind of, that it's the nature of a self to be in those aggregates, uh, actually renunciation won't arise. You'll just think it's hopeless. And actually, I want to point out, um, that's actually, I mean, actually that view, I was struck by this once. I was like, I work as a psychologist, and I was struck by this. I was studying, I was like, oh, that's the view of psychology. Actually, like there is all of, like, Freud actually said that. He said the purpose of therapy was to exchange neurosis for ordinary human suffering, which I thought was kind of funny. But actually, the entire tradition followed that. In other words, there's no, I mean, if you said to a typical psychologist or psychiatrist, my goal in working with my psyche is to achieve absolute, utter liberation from suffering, the tradition would say that, well, that's doesn't exist. What are you talking like? That's some kind of delusion. Maybe you need medication. Um, not really, actually. I'm exaggerating slightly, but only slightly, I think. Because there is what's the word? Yeah, actually, there's a provision for cultural. They would say, oh, well, that's a cultural difference. You're Buddhist, okay. It's that you're expressing your culture, I'll leave you alone. But really, it's kind of a delusion. Uh, our culture actually doesn't, the culture, American culture, I'm talking about this where I'm sitting, actually doesn't have a view that liberation is possible, right? Uh, anyway, yeah, certainly not liberation from mental afflictions. So the idea here is that if there's no self, if there's no substantially existent, self-sufficient self in the aggregates, then it's possible to be liberated. And I'll point out this takes a lot of contemplation, right? Because if you haven't thought about it much, you might say, well, then who's liberated? Uh, and who's liberated is the merely labeled self, right? Which is actually the only self that exists. Because that self-sufficient, substantially existent self never did exist in the actually, there was a term from the Uttara Tantra that said primordially pure, right? It means that self never existed to start with. From the beginning, there is no beginning, but from beginningless time, the self-sufficient, substantially existent self never did exist, right? So actually, it's interesting because part of what's being gotten at here also is it's kind of funny. I'll just share a reflection. This is my own reflection now, not something from the text. Is if you start contemplating a lot on impermanence and suffering, the first two of these, right? You'll see things that are true, right? In other words, it is momentarily impermanent, and it is in the nature of suffering. And there is the suffering of suffering. There is the suffering of impermanence, of change, and there is the pervasive suffering. You'll see that. And now the teachings don't say this, but I'm sharing my own experience. My own experience is that what happens for me is that a very strong sense of self-grasping arises, like, because the feeling is, excuse my language, but like, oh crap, this sucks for me. Like this is really bad for me that I'm stuck in suffering. How could I be stuck in suffering? So then you contemplate empty and selfless, right? So you contemplate them in relation to the truth of suffering, though, right? And then you start to develop it. And somebody said to Kensho, well, I don't quite get this. And he said, think about it deeply, over and over. Because what he was getting at is then you start to understand something about the self that does exist can achieve liberation, right? And that's that feeling of a heavy self that's stuck in this prison doesn't exist, right? So the suffering exists actually, and one way of saying it is suffering exists conventionally. It does exist conventionally, right? It's not an ultimate truth, but it is a conventionally existing truth for sure. But the self-sufficient, substantially existent self doesn't exist conventionally either. It doesn't exist at all. And as you contemplate that, you start to feel, oh, maybe liberation is possible, right? And that leads to then, in the teachings, it says this. That leads to then you say, all right, well, I have no doubt now, right? Is what I was going back to prominent. You say suffering exists, especially all three kinds of suffering exist. And if that heavy feeling of a self-sufficient, substantiating self doesn't exist, then is it possible to eliminate that suffering? And then, like the medical question, first you have to say, well, what's the cause of it? Where does that suffering come from, right? And that gets to the truth of the origin of suffering, the four aspects of the truth of origin of suffering. And actually, this is interesting. I want to share first the four wrong views about the origin of suffering. And what I want to ask you to do is reflect on them together with me for a moment, because on some level we have these, right? Just like we have the view, you say, I would say, I remember when I was like my 20s, I would have said, who in the world would think things aren't impermanent? Of course things are impermanent. Um, but but then, when somebody I loved died, I was quite surprised. Um, it's like not surprised, but shocked, because I hadn't understood impermanence, right? So I'm getting at, like, you grasp at these things even if you don't know you grasp at them, right? You have to check your own experience. Am I living as, you say, well, obviously there's suffering, but am I living as though I'm in the pervasive compounded suffering? Or am I living as though I don't, am I living as someone who doesn't see that? If I'm living as somebody who doesn't see that, then I don't understand it really. I haven't had a deep understanding of it, right? So now we're going to get to, there are four, in terms of the origin of suffering, there are four wrong understandings that we may have. One is suffering has no cause, right? Like, oh, it's just the nature of things. It has no cause. It's the nature of things to be suffering. Another is it has only one cause. That's another wrong view. Another wrong view is, and then there are two more wrong views. I'm going to summarize them together because they're related to two different Hindu schools. But essentially, what they're saying is suffering is caused by God. Brahma. One is so one is that suffering is caused by the Om sound that emanates from Brahma, and the other is Ishvara. That Ishvara kind of causes suffering on purpose. Anyway, I don't think we necessarily grasp that it comes from Brahma, for example, but actually, for sure, right? In our actually, I mean, it's not, these aren't unique, right? To actually, so you can check. I may not have all four of those, but you have some of them, right? We all have some of those wrong views. So you have to check for yourself. Which wrong views do I have about the cause of suffering? Is it that there's no cause? That it's just the nature of things to suffer, so you accept it and make the best of it um, until you're done, until you die, or something like that. Or is it that it has some kind of singular cause, or is it that it's caused by some kind of divine being? Um, Actually, sometimes we also it doesn't say this there, but you know, actually, that's funny. The one cause sometimes people may think is the one cause, um, you know, some other person, um, whether it's somebody in your personal life or a political figure or something, is all suffering caused by somebody else, for example. Of course, all those are wrong views according to Buddhism, right? So anyway, the first of the four um, aspects of the truth of origin is cause. And what it says here is this is to address the idea that suffering has no cause, is this is Buddhist logic, right? And there is a result doesn't come without a cause, right? So, and impermanent functioning things are results, right? They're not like space, a non-affirming negation, they're functional things. So anything that functions has causes, right? And so if all function, it's like trees have, tree has a substantial cause, which is its acorn, for example, right? And then it has cooperative conditions like soil and water and light. And so the suffering aggregates are impermanent functioning things, so they do have causes, right? It's a logical analysis that they say. And then in this context, what it says is, so in general, and this is actually in this teaching, what it says is it focuses on cravings, and then the commentaries go into a lot of detail. So I'll just briefly summarize it, which is um, in general, it's on the deepest level, it's ignorance grasping at itself is the cause, right? But that's not what's, and that's true. Actually, it says that in the commentaries, and it's true, but then in a more general way, that leads to the various mental afflictions and karma, right? So those are the cause of the samsaric. Those are the main causes of these samsaric aggregates. And then in this particular teaching, it emphasizes craving um, among the various mental afflictions as the cause of samsaric suffering. Um, and so again, that's the teaching, right? That the cause of suffering, you could say so there are different ways you can contemplate it. It's craving, or it's karma and mental afflictions, or it's ignorance. Those are different levels of depth. But the point here is, so you check, right? Now you have to contemplate, you would contemplate that, right? Until you would say, well, is that the cause or not, actually, right? Of um, suffering. And what I want to ask you just to think about for a moment, again, because this is what we're getting at here, is, I mean, people have heard this teaching before, the part about that there's a cause of suffering, and the cause of suffering is karma or mental afflictions or ignorance, or there are different explanations of different levels of subtlety and depth. Um, but I'll say this, but how much have you contemplated on that to check in your own observation? Does that seem to be true? And I'll share something. I was just reading recently. Uh, uh, was actually a text by a friend about the Dalai Lama, and in it, the Dalai Lama was saying, after a great deal of contemplation, he began to, at a certain age, when he was young, in his 20s, he became convinced. He became sort of experientially convinced. He was like, oh wow, there is, particularly in his case, he said that ignorance is the cause of suffering, and that ignorance can be removed. And he felt, wow, I can achieve liberation. He had this like experience, right, of like, through his own contemplation, of a kind of absolute conviction that liberation was possible and that he could achieve it. That was before bodhicitta, before he was focusing on bodhicitta when he was quite young. Point here is like, we have to contemplate like that. Does that make sense? Until you develop that kind of conviction. Um, Otherwise, it's just like, well, the Buddha said that craving is the cause of suffering. Well, that actually doesn't do much. It's good to know that, but that actually doesn't help you develop on the path. Then the next point is, so the first of the four, right, of the truth of this was cause. The next is origin. And you might say, what's the difference between cause and origin? So the first one was overcoming the wrong view that there's no cause, right? Which means, and you logically say, well, of course, there has to be a cause, because samsaric aggregates are a functioning thing. All functioning things develop through causes and conditions. Origin is getting at that there's not a single cause, and which was because earlier one of the wrong views was there's one cause, right? And so this is getting at that there's a network of interrelated causes and conditions that lead to suffering, and that that suffering arises through interdependent factors. And when you contemplate on it, I already said, right, it's craving, but craving arises due to ignorance, right? And craving is related to our karma. So you start to see there's a network of causes and conditions. And I just want to say, like, so first of all, that's according to Buddhism, if you contemplate it, that's the truth. In other words, that's what you find, is that there's not a single cause of suffering. I want to say something just about for a practice for myself, again, just reflecting on this myself, is like, I was like, because I thought about it, I was like, well, who really thinks suffering has one cause? Like, I don't, like, in other words, that seemed kind of funny to me. But then I'll just share my own reflection. I thought, do I have that ignorant? Do I have that wrong view? And at first I thought I didn't think I did, but then I realized I do, actually, and I'll share how. Like, when I'm upset about something, almost every time I think there's one cause of it. And like you know, so like if I were to get actually, like if Jan and I had a big argument, then I would think Jan's the cause of all suffering, in that moment. I'd say, oh, what, there's one cause of suffering, and it's Jan, and if only she would be different, everything would be fine. Um, which is ridiculous, but it's actually it's how I sometimes interact. Actually, never with Jan yet. Hopefully never will. But but it is what we do, and actually, if nowadays, like, if people actually do that about, it's usually about some in America these days, it's about a political figure, usually one or another, right? Oh, this is the cause of all the suffering, but the important point here is that, and actually, so if you're contemplating this one of origin, then you would say, okay, like, so let's say, I'm gonna give an example. Like, let's say I was upset with somebody and I felt like, oh, they're the cause of my suffering. Right? Then I would think, what origin, right, of the four aspects of the four aspects of the truth of origins of suffering. And I would think, well, actually, they're appearing as an enemy right now. Why are they appearing as an enemy? Right? And then you start to explore, oh, there's a network of causes here. I have some kind of negative karma with them, right? Where did that negative karma come from? Mental afflictions, right? There is anger in that case or something, right? So it comes from mental afflictions. I must have harmed them in the past. Now they're harming me back. Now I'm angry at them again. I'm compounding the suffering again. I'm creating the cause for more suffering, right? And more relationship to that person in an angry way. Where does that anger come from? It comes from craving for things to be different, right? Why am I craving for things to be different? Because I grasp at a self, right? Oh, there's a whole network of causes of my suffering, right? And they're all interrelated, So this person's appearing this way to me, but it's due to all these other causes. And the root cause, if you trace it back, is ignorance grasping at a self, right? And then from that comes a craving, right? And so that's a very profound one, right? And if you check, part of the point here is, why are we studying this, right? The four aspects of the truth of origin. Well, you check in your own experience. Is that true? In other words, or is Jan really the cause of all suffering? Um, if you check, definitely not. She's pretty strong, but not that strong. She can't cause all the suffering in the universe. Just joking, right? So you check, and you keep checking over and over again. You look at examples of your own suffering, and you say, what's the cause of this? Where does it really come from, right? And you introspect, you look, and you check, is the Buddha right or wrong? The Buddha is saying it comes from karma and mental afflictions, or it comes from ignorance. Does that fit my analysis if I analyze, right? Um, then the next of the four here is what they call strong production. And again, just the word, you might think, well, wait a second, we already said it has it has a cause. But here, the one way, I'll read two quotes. One, it says, afflictions and karma are strong producers of suffering, in that they give rise to suffering with great force. Um, and part of the point here, what is being gotten at here? Another way, I wrote this note from some other commentary. Karma and the afflictions are strong enough to be the main causes of samsaric suffering. So what's being gotten at here actually is overcoming the view that suffering is caused by God, or a God, or some other divine force outside of yourself, right? Or it's not, that the root of suffering is not your culture, it's not your parents, it's not God, it's not the government, it's not an international cabal, it's not, there's not some, you don't need any of those. Those may be conditions or something like that, but the actual cause of suffering. So when it says strong production, what it's being gotten at is your mental afflictions are strong enough to produce your suffering. Does that make sense? And somebody else's mental afflictions are strong enough to produce their suffering. And again, you have to check that, right? In other words, because somewhere in us, we often feel that, well, yeah, maybe my mental afflictions are playing a role. I often feel that myself, actually. I'll think, well, yes, of course, my mental afflictions play a role, but so is this. Right? And I think I've told that story before, but I made that mistake because when I shared the story, but one day I was talking to Kensho Rinpoche and I was saying to him, I said that story, right, where I said, oh, it must have been very difficult losing your country when the communist Chinese army came in and they were bombing his monastery. His monastery was obliterated. He had to flee in the day. It was night or day, but he had to flee with his uncle and walk through the Himalayas. And I said that must have been difficult. And he said, why are you saying that's difficult? I didn't say it was difficult. Why are you making up something about my life story? Right? um, because I was projecting, oh, the communist Chinese army caused him to suffer, caused suffering. He said, I didn't say that. I said there were bombs. I said I had to leave. I had to walk through the Himalayas, but I didn't say, my point is like we make up stories in our mind about the cause of suffering because we don't think it's our karma and afflictions, right? So you check. Is it strong enough? Are my karma and my mental affliction strong enough, or is there some other cause? Is it God, or is it something else, some other being? And what Buddhism is saying is, your mind is strong enough. Actually, it's a radical statement, right? Buddhism is saying your mind is strong enough to produce samsara or nirvana. Your mind is that powerful, right? Your mental continuum has the power to produce enlightenment, Buddhahood, infinite bliss, infinite wisdom, infinite love, compassion, or hell. Your mind is that powerful. You don't need something external to produce those. That's what this is. So when it says strong producer, it's saying that. And again, like, you have to check. Well, is that true to me? Do I understand it that way? Does that fit what I observe? And if we're honest with ourselves, I think this is a hard one actually to realize, to actually contemplate and go, wow, my mind does that. It's not something external. Often, and we may feel, well, it's a little bit my mind, but mostly that, or it's partly my mind and partly that. And this is saying, when it's your suffering, it's your mind. That's the ultimate producer. And then the last of these four is condition. And what that means is getting at is this, that the condition, they're talking about the contaminated aggregates again, right? Your contaminated aggregates, your body and mind. And so what's being gotten at here when they say condition is, actually, this is an important point for practice also, is that at the moment of your previous life's death, this is what happens to us, actually, according to Buddhism, is when we're dying, and so you think of it right now in terms of your past life, actually, that whatever realm you were in, whatever kind of being you were, as you were dying, when we were dying, we feel at a certain point like we're losing, we have because our deepest instinct is an ignorance of self-grasping until we realize emptiness. We're grasping at a self. And we feel that death is going to annihilate us, that we're going to lose everything. Actually, I can say that. Some people say, oh, I'm fine if I die. But then like, I thought this myself. Well, actually, like right now, if somebody started to steal my car, I'd be quite upset, like, well, death is going to steal not just your car, right? Death is going to steal, if somebody came along and said, I'm going to chop off your arm, you'd be quite upset, right? Death is going to take more than your arm. If somebody came along and said, oh, I'm going to take your house, I'm commandeering your house, you'd be quite upset. Death is going to take more than your house, right? So as we die and feel that we're losing everything, including our sense of self and our home and our, actually, if we retire, or somebody we care about dies, right? It's like a big adjustment. You lose all those when you die, right? All your attachments to people, all your home, your body, your arms, your legs, your face, your name, so a kind of strong craving for existence. As you're dying, you feel, no, I want to, I may want this, or at least I want to exist, and that craving. So that's the condition, is that craving, which then activates, because you crave for existence, it activates your mental afflictions and your karma. And then a certain karma ripens because of, they say, is like activated by that craving. And that karma throws you out of your control. They say throwing karma, right? Which again is getting back to the pervasive compounded aggregates. Without any control, then that karma throws you somewhere. And you don't have any control over the process again, unless if you're a samsaric being, you don't have control over the process. So craving is the condition that throws you into your next set of compounded aggregates. And whatever that karma happened to be determines what kind of aggregates you get. and what kind of life you get for the next round in the cycle of samsara. So you see what's being gotten at here, though? It's so you analyze these things and you say, well, first of all, is that true, right? And are those the causes of suffering? And part of the point here is like you contemplate these deeply so that if you come to this point, you would really feel, right? If in other words, if you disagree with these, then you say, well, I don't believe that. I'm going to go do something else. I'll go whatever, distract myself. But if you come to some kind of recognition experientially, like the Dalai Lama did in that story I was just telling, right? Then you feel that suffering is like a prison. Now I know the cause of it, the causes of it, right? The network of causes, the origin, right? The origin of those is these different causes that come together, right? Ignorance and karma and mental afflictions. And then you say, well, is it possible to destroy those causes? Because then I could be free, right? Then I could achieve liberation. Can those be destroyed? I'll pause there. Any questions? Because I've covered the first two noble truths, and those two go together, right? Those are the. By the way, those are called the true suffering is to be known, and the true origins are to be abandoned, right? And those are a causal set. The one causes the other, right? The origin causes the suffering. So that's a set. So yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, getting back to the first set on the that life is suffering. That chart that we were given, I don't know if you have it there with you, Lauren, but apparently from the master's program, it indicates the third of those 4 points as being apprehension of suffering as clean.
Oh yeah, sometimes I say pure, like that's why I say pure, but like I think pure is a better translation of that term.
Yeah, well, I get that point, but the thing that confuses me, and it just looks like a mistake to me, is that then it's going into the, what contradicts that is suffering is empty because it's devoid of supervisory self. And I think I understand, we discussed this last week, that distinction between empty and selfless, and I guess that's what they're getting at here by breaking it down into two, but the corresponding apprehension of suffering as clean or pure and then going into empty, that just, I don't see the connection there.
I'm sorry, makes the connection between what and what? I understood about the pure, but the connection between, what are the two things you're not seeing the connection between exactly?
Well, just, I guess I raised 2 points there, so it gets kind of confusing, but the third point being apprehension of suffering as clean. Mm-hmm. And then the point that apparently contradicts that is saying that that things are empty because they're devoid of a supervisory self that is a different entity. So I don't see the connection between.
Oh, I see. No, yeah. So that actually no, because that doesn't disprove that one. That's not the. Now I understand your question. No, the empty and selfless both disprove self. And suffering disproves pure and pleasure. So in other words, impermanent is the antidote. If you realize impermanence, it overcomes the view of permanence. But if you realize the one called suffering, right, that overcomes the view that samsara is pleasurable, and it also overcomes the view that samsara is pure. There is, because so we have sometimes a view like my aggregates, are pure, or somebody else's aggregates are pure if we're attached to them or something. And so here, it's the view of suffering that you recognize my own aggregates and others' aggregates are in the nature of suffering. Therefore, they're not pure because they're contaminated by karma and mental afflictions. So I get why you'd be confused, but no, empty doesn't disprove that. It's suffering and disproves two of the four.
Well, if I understand you, we should really collapse number 2 and 3 into one thing. That thinking that suffering is happiness and thinking of suffering as clean or pure, really, they're talking about the same thing there, right?
Yeah, and I guess you could say they're related or something. I mean, they're not identical, but they're related in the sense that because and part of the idea there is like yeah, they are related though, aren't they? Like, so I'll give an example. Like if you actually when they do advertising, they play with this, don't they? Like if you see like, some you want to go to vacation somewhere and like they have these pictures of a place, right? And it looks like very pleasurable and it looks very pure, like clean, it looks very clean and wonderful and you know so it's sort of two aspects of that, right? Like if you look at the vacation, actually, if you look up any like whatever, some big fancy vacation place or a cruise or something, right? It's going to look very clean and pure, and it's also going to look like a pleasure garden. And so those are like two aspects of that perception, and then this contemplation would actually recognize it's in the nature of suffering, right? So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
not pure. You're gonna have, and actually, it's true, right? Then people go there, and then they have arguments, and whatever, all kinds of problems can happen. So so you would recognize like that. Yeah, they're related, but they're not identical in that sense.
And then I think, number four under wrong conceptions, of course, is getting at, apprehension of sufferings as having a self. So really the points that contradict that in that next column are empty and selfless, just being two different levels of subtlety. So I don't know. You know, I think in criticizing a teaching, that I'm committing a sin, but I think that this chart needs to be reworked. At least the way I'm understanding it is, it was just very confusing.
Yeah, no, I don't seem to have that exact chart, so I'm not seeing it, but I get it. Yeah, no, because you're right though. That empty and selfless are both. They're just like you could say a grosser and a subtler level of
Yeah.
addressing the wrong view of a self that suffering hasn't that there's a self
Okay.
that's there. Yeah,
All
that's
right.
right.
Well, yeah, good for helping me. Thanks for helping me clarify that.
Oh,
One other point I had, Lauren, when you began the class, you were talking about, when we reflect on compassion and how we understand that. And, that hit home pretty hard for me because just yesterday in particular, I was thinking about that because I took my dog for a walk, as I typically do midday, take her for her longer walk. And she was attacked by another dog. And it was not the first time that had happened. And my dog is very gentle and doesn't like conflict. And this other dog is just really mean. And so when I got home, I recognized in my own mind that I was still really disturbed by that. So I was reflecting a lot on that. And I was thinking, well, is that the only thing that's going on? And then I thought about, well, my generator hasn't been working and the company is not honoring the warranty. So I was thinking that's another thing that's piled on, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, but is that the only thing? And and what it was all really bringing back to me is because I've been studying in recent weeks a lot about the 12 links of interdependence, and my mind kept returning again and again to the second link, which is that foundation of impressions that we have in our mind stream based on wrong views. So it's that creation of karma that just keeps throwing out our urges and our conceptions and our projections about things. And I reflect again and again about how ironclad that is. And unless we reflect upon it, that we are deceived into thinking that those urges that arise and the projections they cause are existing out there on their own. So, the vicious dog and the dishonest company that doesn't honor their warranty and things like that. And I think again and again how that is for me the jailer, the thing that really keeps me bound. And so when I reflect on that from the perspective of compassion, uh, because for one thing, I've always had kind of a problem with this notion of self-compassion. It always struck me as more of a matter of self-indulgence, and maybe that's a bit too harsh, but when I think about it from this perspective, I can think about it as self-compassion because I realize that I'm just a slave, to those urges that keep arising out of this, timeless, just from beginning of time that I've been collecting all of those impressions in that second link that just keep, I mean, they have created my consciousness and that I'm just bound by that. And then, to the extent that we all also recognize, of course, that everybody else in samsara is in the same boat, that that base level of impressions in our mind stream that have just been created from beginning of time just keep controlling us and that keep creating all the suffering that we have. So I don't know. I think all of those 12 links are very, very important, of course, but that's the one that has just really been coming home to me over the past weeks. So
Well, it's another way of getting at the exact same, right? I mean, those are two different, the 12 links and the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths are two ways of developing renunciation, actually. So um, those are very connected teachings, is one point.
yeah.
One other small just comment I would make too is, um, many years ago I thought this, and then I saw some other people have said the same thing afterwards, like, is that, from the perspective of Buddhist practice, that I would translate it renunciation, or sometimes I think a better translation is definite emergence, but that kind of mind, right? The first of the, the wish for liberation.
Yeah.
Uh, that actually, I think that is self-compassion. So like when you're wishing to achieve liberation from samsara, actually that's the ultimate expression of self-compassion. I mean, actually, well, bodhicitta would be the ultimate expression of it, but I mean, that's a very deep version of self-compassion, is wishing for liberation from karma and mental afflictions. That is self-compassion. So in Buddhism, I think that would be the version of self-compassion. And
Yeah. I think so too. It's because eventually, of course, we're aiming toward a non-dual state. And that non-dual state satisfies, as they say, both the needs, so that, they coalesce. Um,
I read also in that same book I was reading that it was making me, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it was something like the Dalai Lama had said. He was sort of sometimes would joke and say, "Oh, people need like a long rest, a long relaxation." And then somebody said, "Well, what does that mean? To have a long rest?" And he said, "To not have the mental afflictions."
well,
Like
yeah.
he was saying that means not having mental afflictions. It doesn't mean going somewhere else, or it's not that. It's actually not having any mental afflictions in your mind.
Yeah, because
Is
they harass us, right?
helpful.
All the time.
But, yeah, other comments or questions before we go on? Right? Yeah.
Let's see if I still got it in my head here. You were talking about the grasping, self-grasping at the moment of death, and how the fear of annihilation and leads to that self-grasping, which flings us forward and samsara. And I thought I've heard that, obviously I heard that concept before, but like phrase like that, it was really vivid. Um, and it made me wonder if direct realization of selflessness, of emptiness, like becoming an arhat, familiarizes a person um with selflessness, so that when at the moment of death there's no self-grasping, there's no fear of annihilation, because you already have experienced selflessness. And if that's why you don't get flung to uncontrolled to another life.
Yeah, I mean, well, one problem, like, is that, I mean, I mean, there are different presentations in Theravada and Mahayana, practice for that. But I'll use the example of Mahayana to answer your question, and then if you want, I can also say from a Theravada perspective. But from a Mahayana perspective, that is, so what they say actually is that once somebody's an Arya Bodhisattva, right, has achieved the path of seeing, or the path of meditation, or at least the path of seeing, and hopefully, eventually also the path of meditation, and they're on the bhumis, they're an Arya Bodhisattva. What they actually say is that person, there's a way they phrase it, is still within samsara, but is not a samsaric being. And one day I was like, what does that mean? I asked Khensa Rinpoche that question we were talking about. I was like, I don't understand this. And he said, he said, well, if they're not yet fully enlightened, then they're still within samsara. They're not a Buddha yet. If they're not at the, if they're in the, if they still have mental afflictions, so especially if they're in the first 7 bhumis. He said, but this is getting at your question, but he said, but their aggregates are not conditioned by karma and mental afflictions. Because at the moment of death, they don't give rise to craving because they don't have self-grasping, because they've realized emptiness, just like you're saying. And so that person doesn't activate. They don't have craving at that moment, like you said, because they've realized emptiness directly. So that bodhisattva, so because they've realized emptiness directly, they, even at that kind of profound moment of death, they don't give rise to that kind of self-grasping. And then instead, it's their compassion and their prayers that sort of lead to a, they take a rebirth, or they emanate a body, or they whatever, to continue their practice and to benefit others. But they can do that because, a bodhisattva who hasn't realized emptiness may wish they could do that, but still, because they haven't realized emptiness directly, when actual death comes, the self-grasping instinct, arises. Whereas once the person's become an Arya bodhisattva, you're right, that doesn't happen at that moment. And so they're not under the control. In that sense, they're not any longer under the control, right? Their aggregates are not under the control of karma and mental afflictions. Their aggregates are under the influence of compassion. I thought that was really funny one time. I sometimes joke like that I was listening to a teaching by Garchen Rinpoche, and I thought it was very wonderful. He said actually, in Tibet we talk about, oh, this person's an emanation, right, of Avalokiteshvara, and he said, actually, we're all emanations of something. It's just some of us are emanations of mental afflictions, and others are emanations of compassion, but we all emanated from something else, and so it's getting at what you're getting at in a way, which is like, yeah, well, different. So does that make sense? Or did you have more questions?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. And just to, I could be totally off it, but just like, so from like a Theravada perspective, that would be why upon death you would attain nirvana.
Yeah, so you're right. Like, so, and that's the difference. I guess the part that's different there is that in the Theravada tradition, you would differentiate. There are like somebody who's an Arya who's seen emptiness directly. There are once returners, or they're non-return. There are stream mentors and once returners and non-returners and arhats. And so an arhat who's eliminated all the mental afflictions, they would, at the moment of death, they would say not take, from the Theravada tradition, they would say they don't take rebirth because there's no karma and mental affliction to cause a rebirth. Whereas like, but even even like for example, a once returner or a non-return, those beings, they don't take rebirth out of bodhicitta, wish to benefit others, but they've realized emptiness, but they need a few more rebirths to eliminate the last of their mental afflictions. So they take rebirth through the power of their concentration or through the power of their practice in order to continue to eliminate the last few mental afflictions. So there are beings like that in the Theravada tradition, where it's like the arhats don't take rebirth according to that view. According to Mahayana, they say arhats they don't take rebirth through power of karma and mental afflictions, but their mental continuum continues in a kind of subtle state or something. But the others would take rebirth in order to continue their practice, usually through the power of concentration, because a lot of them go to the form realm or the formless realms to practice, but because they have to eliminate mental afflictions associated with the form realm or the formless realm sometimes. But others can take rebirth in the desire realm to finish the last few mental afflictions there, but it's through the power of their practice and concentration.
Fascinating. Thank you.
And then Robin, maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Is there time?
Yeah, there's one more. Yeah, we can do one more question.
This is more of a comment. A couple of months ago, I was at a teaching with Zong Rinpoche, and he was talking about, I think Phyllis was there too, about when we think about the great suffering that is all around us and the experience of, empathy and concern that arises. And it just seems like at this time in history, it's like every day is a new intrigue in terms of, disturbing the mind with all of the suffering that's going on. And he was talking about how this idea of all pervasive condition, suffering is probably a good place to experience, to cultivate compassion, as opposed to getting into the drama of what's going on. You know, we look at it in terms of all of us experiencing this kind of uncontrolled, you know, daily pervasive suffering, and maybe it's like a little bit less direct than just the suffering of suffering. And you know, it really rang, or it struck me that this is sort of what these contemplations could go toward. And maybe it's an easier, I don't know, what do you think about that? As opposed to like thinking about the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of change, and how all of us around us are experiencing those, obviously, but to look at it from this level of pervasive suffering maybe is helpful to our minds. And so that we don't spin out in grasping at solutions that really aren't there.
Do you find, like, I mean, when you said that, I relate, and I guess I'll make a quick comment. Like, as a, I was actually even like, I mean, whether it's something very specific or individual, like when John shared about the mean dog was attacking his gentle dog, like I noticed my mind immediately, until like it started to go towards, well, I was identifying with, I like John so much, and I was like, oh, you know, and I was like identifying with his dog, and I was like, oh, and that other dog is no, and there started to come a feeling like, oh, that other dog's no good. And then I had to stop and go, oh, wait, that other dog is subject to the pervasive compounded suffering. And I was thinking, like,
Yeah.
you think about, you know, if you think about, you know, there's so much polarization in our minds that then we can polarize, you know, so like, if I think of that, it's very easy for me, if I focus on the suffering of it, the suffering of suffering, like to polarize to, oh, I have compassion for this person, but then this other animal or person is bad, you know, in some way, right? Like, and if you focus on the pervasive compounded one, it really works against any polarization, doesn't it? Because,
You know, in terms of these beings who are creating the cause for eons in hell, who's to say which suffering is greater? You know, and the chain of events that they're subscribing to, are putting themselves firmly into the throes of, you know, by virtue of what they're doing now. And how long has this been going on? You know, back and forth. Now it's your turn to be the one that's being persecuted. And
yeah, it's endless, right?
yeah, I mean, and it does sort of give you a sense of like, it's sobering quality, but it really takes a lot of work to make sure that you're not being glib, maybe, or removed. What is this compassion like that has a sense of you know, I don't know. It's probably a bigger question or contemplation than what we have time for today. You know, when we think about our lamas, they're so cheerful, and yet they walked out of Tibet. You know, the soles of my teacher's feet were like, you know, thick as an actual shoe sole from walking with no shoes out of you know, toward the end. You know, through the mountains, and yet the most cheerful, happy chappy I've ever met. You know, so anyway.
I just really agree with you. I actually think focusing on the pervasive compounded suffering is the most, for I think in general, but especially now, it's very, for me, I guess I'll say it's very helpful. And like
Helpful.
the others tend to, for me, honestly, cause sometimes, you know, more, sometimes, I mean, it's easier to get caught up in confusion unless you put them in the context. You know, if you look at the other sufferings in the context of the pervasive compounded suffering, you know, and then it's easier to have compassion for oneself and everybody involved. Whereas if you only focus, I guess maybe that's the way to say it. If you look at the suffering of suffering in the context of the pervasive suffering, for me, then it's that's quite effective. Whereas if I just look at the suffering of suffering, it tends to lead to more, well, also it's not as clear that what's the solution, you know, like, and it's also can lead to polarization and sort of, for me, it oftentimes then it leads to kind of some other mental affliction, actually, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, at the time I didn't understand it, but this conversation has really underscored what it was he was referring to, I think.
Yeah, he's very, sounds very wise of it. So,
We're all lucky, aren't we? In that sense,
yeah.
of have access to these teachers.
So,
Thanks so
thank
much
you.
for this discussion.
Oh, thank you all. And I know we should start. We'll do dedication, and I know. Well, it's already it's on the website. So we've got the next classes. I think through Jody, I can't remember. Did we do? We did certainly through February, but did I also put it March? I think I did.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure March is up there.
Okay, good. So we're good then for a while. But okay. So and in the next class we'll just continue with these 16 aspects. We'll do the aspects of cessation and of path and the true paths. So because we didn't get to those yet, so we'll cover those next class. And the reading, if you want to do it, is just those, you know, the two sections I mentioned in this same text. You know, it appears twice, so you can look at both. Then the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow, where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And lastly, may we all be able to meditate effectively on the Four Noble Truths, with their 16 aspects, in order to develop renunciation and bodhicitta and the Arya paths that actually bring about the cessations, right? So the actual Arya paths that lead to the cessations that overcome the causes of suffering and thereby eliminate the resultant suffering itself. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks.